Under the pale glow of the full moon, the waves crashed harder than usual, as if the ocean itself was restless. Arga cast his worn-out net one last time, praying for enough fish to feed himself tomorrow. His stomach had been empty since morning, and his hands trembled with exhaustion. Just as he was about to pull the net back, it grew heavy, too heavy for the measly catch he usually brought in. His heart pounded with sudden hope. Maybe tonight the sea had finally blessed him. But when he dragged the net onto the shore, no fish spilled out. Instead, a shimmer of green silk slid onto the sand, glowing faintly under the moonlight. It was unlike any fabric he had ever seen. So soft it seemed alive, so radiant it looked woven from the waves themselves. As he reached out to touch it, the ocean grew still. Then, without warning, a figure rose from the water. Her hair flowed like the tide, her gowns glittered with the same green silk, and her eyes burned brighter than the moon. Argus stumbled backward, his breath stolen from his chest. Every story he had ever heard as a child came rushing back. The warnings of the Sea Queen, the mistress of the southern waters, the one mortals were forbidden to desire. And yet here she was, standing before him, her gaze fixed only on him. "You have touched what belongs to me," she said, her voice as soft as a lullaby, yet heavy as thunder. Arga's knees weakened. He wanted to run, but his body betrayed him, frozen by fear and awe. The green silk lay between them, half in the sand, half in the waves, binding them in silence. Then she smiled, not with cruelty, but with something far more dangerous. "Perhaps it is not the sea that has chosen you. Perhaps it is me." The waves curled around his feet, and Arga felt his world tilt, as if his life had just been claimed by something far greater than hunger, poverty, or the land he stood on. He had no idea that this single night would mark the beginning of a love forbidden by both gods and men. Yet the seeds of that fate had been sown long before the silk touched his hands. Arga was the poorest fisherman in the village, the one people pitied in silence, but rarely helped. His father had died at sea when he was still a boy, swallowed by the same waves Arga now depended on for survival. His mother had withered away soon after, leaving him nothing but a tiny hut near the shore and an old net patched more times than he could count. The other fishermen mocked him for his bad luck, for the way his net always came up nearly empty, as if the ocean itself had cursed him. And yet, Arga never turned bitter. He rose before dawn each day, walked barefoot across the sand, and whispered a quiet prayer to the sea before casting his net. He believed that one day, if he showed enough patience, the ocean would answer. Still, deep in his heart, he often wondered if his life was meant to be nothing more than a slow fading, forgotten by the world. That was why the woman who had risen from the waves shook him to his core. She was no mere vision of beauty. She was a living contradiction, terrifying and mesmerizing all at once. The stories he had heard from elders echoed in his mind. Tales of Nyi Roro Kidul, the queen of the southern sea, who could bless or curse with a glance, who claimed men's souls when they strayed too far into her domain. To even look at her too long was to invite madness, they said. But as she stood there under the moonlight, her smile still lingering, Arga felt something stir in him that had nothing to do with fear. It was a longing he could not name, a pull deeper than hunger, stronger than despair. For the first time, he wondered if the curse that haunted his life might have been a preparation for this moment, when the sea itself would notice him. And as the waves lapped gently at his ankles, He knew one thing with certainty. His life was no longer his own. And the truth of that began to unfold the very next night when he returned to the shore, unable to resist the pull of the waves. The village slept in silence behind him, but Arga's heart beat like a drum as he stood where the sea met the sand, waiting without knowing what he waited for. The moon was hidden behind drifting clouds, and the ocean looked darker than ink. Then, just as he thought himself a fool, the water stirred, and she emerged once more. Her green gown shimmered with droplets that caught the faintest light, and her eyes sought only him. "Did you think you could touch what is mine and walk away unclaimed?" she asked softly. Her voice carried a weight that pressed against his chest, yet Arga found himself stepping closer instead of retreating. "I did not mean to take it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I am only a poor man. I own nothing." The queen's gaze softened, though the waves still curled with restless power around her. "That is why you were chosen. You belong to no one, and so you may belong to me."
Her words rattled in his mind. Chosen? By the Queen of the Southern Sea? It was madness. Every tale warned of men lured to their doom, of villagers who vanished after nights by the shore, their bodies never found. Yet here she stood, not dragging him under, but speaking as though she had waited for him. The wind howled, and for a heartbeat, Arga thought he saw her form blur with the water, as if she were more tide than flesh. "But understand this," she said, her tone now sharper. "If you step further into my world, you cannot remain as you are. The sea does not give without taking." Arga's breath caught, a warning, yet also an invitation. He looked back at the sleeping village, his broken hut, his empty nets, the endless cycle of hunger. Then he turned to her, to the impossible glow of her presence. His body trembled with the weight of choice, but already his heart leaned toward the waves. That night, for the first time, Arga felt the dangerous sweetness of temptation and the first spark of the conflict that would tear his life apart. The next morning, whispers began to stir among the villagers. A group of fishermen had seen him lingering on the shore long after the nets had been hauled in, standing as though entranced, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. Old men muttered about omens, women pulled their children closer, and even his closest neighbor warned him in hushed tones, "Do not let the sea take you, Arga. It has already taken enough of us." Arga tried to laugh it off, but the fear in their eyes unsettled him. They knew the stories better than anyone. Stories of Nyi Roro Kidul luring men into her realm, of fishermen who returned only as corpses washed ashore, green silk tangled around their limbs. And yet, what he had seen was nothing like the curses they described. She had not dragged him down. She had spoken to him as though he mattered, as though he was not the poor, unlucky man everyone believed him to be. That night, when he closed his eyes, he could not sleep. He kept seeing her smile, hearing her words, feeling the ocean's cool fingers brush his feet. By the second night, he gave in. He walked again to the shore, ignoring the villagers' suspicious glances. And there she was, waiting, as if the sea itself bent to her command. "Do you fear me now?" she asked, her voice carrying across the wind. "I fear losing myself," Arga admitted, his throat dry. Her laugh was like water flowing over stone, gentle, but filled with hidden strength. "Then you already know what is at stake." The waves rose higher that night, curling around his knees, tugging him closer, as if urging him to step further. He stood trembling on the edge, torn between two worlds. Behind him was the village, suspicious and cold, where his life was nothing but hunger and failure. Before him was the queen, radiant and dangerous, offering him something he could not yet name. And though he forced himself to step back before dawn, the line between land and sea had already begun to blur in his heart. The days that followed became a torment of choices. Each morning, Arga forced himself to cast his net, but his hands shook, his eyes wandered toward the horizon, and his mind drifted to the memory of her emerald gown. His catch grew smaller and smaller until the other fishermen laughed outright, calling him cursed. Yet none of their jeers hurt him half as much as the aching pull he felt every evening when the waves began to whisper her name. On the fourth night since their meeting, he surrendered. He walked into the sea until the water licked his waist, until the currents threatened to sweep him away. And there she was, rising like a dream, her hair flowing like dark rivers, her eyes glowing with the promise of secrets mortals were never meant to know. "You return," she said softly, though there was no surprise in her tone, only certainty. "I cannot stay away," Arga admitted. His chest burned with shame, but also with relief. For the first time in his life, someone seemed to want him, not for what he could provide, but simply for existing. The queen reached out her hand, pale and dripping with moonlight. "Then take my hand and see what the land will never give you." When his fingers touched hers, the sea erupted. Waves rose high, wrapping around him like living silk, pulling him deeper, but not to drown. Instead, the water shimmered, glowing green, until the ocean floor itself seemed to awaken. In flashes of vision, he saw a palace of coral and pearls, an endless throne room where fish gleamed like lanterns, and an army of spirits bowing low before their queen. For one breathtaking moment, Arga glimpsed her world. But the vision vanished as suddenly as it came, leaving him gasping on the shore, water dripping from his clothes, though no wave had touched him. His heart thundered in his chest, torn between terror and awe. "You belong to me now, whether you wish it or not," she whispered, her smile both tender and sharp. "The sea does not show itself without reason. Remember this, fisherman. You have seen what mortals are forbidden to see." And as she vanished beneath the waves, Arga realized he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The next morning, his body ached as though he had wrestled with the sea itself all night. When he stumbled into the market with the pitiable catch he had managed, the villagers fell silent. Their eyes lingered too long on his wet clothes, on the faint shimmer that clung to his skin like salt, on the way his gaze seemed distant, as though part of him was still underwater. Whispers spread quickly, "He has been touched by the queen." Mothers pulled their children away, old men made signs to ward off curses, and one fisherman spat at his feet, calling him a fool who would bring disaster on them all. Arga felt the sting of their rejection more sharply than ever before, but even that could not smother the memory of what he had seen, the palace beneath the waves, the impossible beauty that had made his poverty seem like nothing but dust. That night, when the queen returned, he did not resist. "You are fading from their world," she said, her hand grazing his cheek like cool foam. "Soon you will see the truth, that the sea can offer what the land never will: riches, power, belonging, and me." Her words wrapped around him like the tide. Each night she drew him deeper, testing him with visions of treasures buried in coral, of ships swallowed whole and turned into golden skeletons, of spirits bound to her will. At first,
Arga trembled at the enormity of it all, but the more he saw, the more his heart swelled with forbidden desire. For once, he was not the outcast, not the cursed man who dragged in empty nets. He was chosen, special, a man who held the queen's gaze. But the village saw the change. His skin carried a faint glow under the moonlight, his eyes reflected the sea even in darkness, and his voice grew distant when he spoke. Some said he was no longer fully human, that the queen was claiming his soul piece by piece. Soon, the elders gathered in secret, speaking of rituals to sever his bond before the sea swallowed him entirely. Arga knew nothing of their plans. He only knew that each night he felt less tied to the land and more bound to her. And deep inside, he began to wonder if resisting her was even possible anymore, or if he had already drowned without realizing it.
That question carved itself into reality the night the storm came. The villagers said it was no ordinary tempest. It was the queen's wrath, a punishment for letting Arga stray too close to her embrace. The sky split with lightning, waves clawed at the shore, and entire boats were torn from their moorings and swallowed whole. As the villagers cried out in fear, their fury turned toward Arga. They dragged him from his hut, shouting that he was the cause, that his cursed love had summoned the sea's vengeance. The elders raised their staffs, preparing the ritual they had spoken of in whispers, a desperate plea to sever his tie with the queen once and for all. But before the first words could leave their lips, the ocean roared and she emerged. Nyi Roro Kidul rose taller than the waves themselves, her gown a storm of living water, her hair streaming like endless rivers. Her eyes blazed with a power that silenced the village. "Touch him," she thundered, her voice carrying over the wind, "and the sea will bury you all." The villagers fell back, trembling, yet their fear only deepened their hatred. They shouted for Arga to choose, land or sea, his people or the queen. The storm raged around him, the ocean pulling him one way, the cries of his kin pulling the other. Arga's heart pounded. For years he had dreamed of belonging, of being seen, of escaping the life of emptiness the village had chained him to. The queen had given him that. Yet here were the faces of those he had grown up beside, the ones who, even in cruelty, had been his only world. Lightning struck so close the ground split at his feet. He looked at her, at the queen who had chosen him, who offered him a kingdom beneath the waves. He looked at them, at the people who had rejected him, but whose blood tied him to the earth. The choice burned in his chest, heavier than the storm. Whichever way he turned, there would be no return. And as the wind howled his name, Arga finally stepped forward.
The world seemed to hold its breath. Every eye in the village, every spirit in the waves, every gust of wind waited to see what fate he would claim. Arga raised his voice above the thunder, his words torn between desperation and resolve. "If I must choose, then I choose with my heart, but my heart belongs to both." The storm cracked open at those words, as though the sea itself raged at his defiance. The queen's eyes narrowed, her beauty suddenly edged with fury. "The sea does not share Arga. To claim me, you must abandon them." Her voice was both plea and command, as if even she could not bear his divided loyalty. But the villagers cried out as well, begging him to resist, to break free, to remember the land that birthed him. Their voices cut him like blades, not out of love, but out of fear. He stood at the center of two worlds, his soul stretched to breaking.
Then, with a strength he did not know he possessed, Arga did not move toward either side. Instead, he stepped deeper into the storm, into the space where land and sea collided. The waves crashed around him, the wind nearly knocked him from his feet, but he lifted his hands and shouted, "If you will not let me belong to both, then I will fight to create a place where both can exist." The sea roared in defiance, but the queen did not strike him down. Instead, she watched, her eyes unreadable, as if weighing whether his heart's madness could reshape what had been forbidden for centuries. Lightning seared the horizon, illuminating the villagers' terrified faces. Some clutched each other, some cursed his name, and some fell to their knees, yet none dared step forward. And so Arga stood alone, braced against the fury of the storm, his body trembling but his will unbroken. The choice was made, not to submit, but to fight for the impossible. The waves surged higher, ready to claim him, and the storm howled with merciless power. But for the first time in his life, Arga no longer felt like prey. He felt like a man who might shape his own destiny, even if it meant drowning in the attempt. The sea struck first. A wall of water rose higher than the huts, curling like the jaws of a monster ready to swallow him whole. Arga braced himself, his fists clenched, his heart screaming louder than the storm. He thought of his father's voice, of his mother's lullabies, of every hungry night he had endured, and then he thought of her, the queen whose touch had shown him he was more than just a forgotten fisherman. He refused to surrender to either fate. As the wave crashed, he did the unthinkable. He stepped forward into it, not resisting, not fleeing, but opening himself to its fury. For a heartbeat, the water wrapped around him like a shroud, and he felt it testing him, dragging at his breath, at his soul. But he shouted through the choking salt, his voice echoing both above and below the surface. "I will not be torn apart. If I belong to the sea, then let the land live in me as well. I will not abandon either." The wave shattered. Instead of crushing him, it split, breaking into sprays of green light that rained down over the beach. The storm faltered, thunder rolling into silence. For the first time in living memory, the ocean listened. The villagers stared in awe, their fear cracking into something else, wonder, and the queen herself emerged again, not furious now, but solemn, her gaze fixed on him as though seeing him truly for the first time.
"You defy the law of worlds," she whispered, her voice carrying across the stillness. "But perhaps you are strong enough to bind them together." Her hand lifted, and the water obeyed. The sea receded, calmer now, though the power beneath it still trembled. She stepped closer, her gown trailing like rivers, and placed her palm against his chest. "Then let it be so. You will belong to both, not as my servant, not as their prisoner, but as the bridge between us." Arga gasped as warmth surged through him, neither wholly of water nor of land, but something in between. His lungs filled easily, as if he could breathe both air and ocean. His skin glowed faintly, kissed by moonlit waves. For the first time, he felt whole. Behind him, the villagers fell to their knees, no longer cursing, but bowing in reverence. Before him, the queen smiled, not in triumph, but in respect. And in that fragile silence, Arga realized he had done what no man before him had dared. He had carved a place where both worlds could meet.
The days that followed carried the weight of a new dawn. The villagers, once cruel and suspicious, now looked upon Arga with reverence. Some still trembled in fear of what he had become, but most began to see him not as a curse, but as a protector, a living bridge between themselves and the restless sea. Fishermen who once mocked him now sought his blessing before casting their nets, whispering his name as though it carried the tide's favor. Children who once turned away now followed him in awe, pointing at the faint shimmer of ocean light that never left his skin. As for the queen, she no longer appeared to him with wrath or riddles. She came with gentleness, with the calm of tides after a storm. Together they walked the shores under moonlight, speaking not as mortal and goddess, but as two souls bound by choice. She told him of ancient battles beneath the waves, of kingdoms unseen, of centuries of longing for someone brave enough to stand at her side, not as a subject, but as an equal. Arga listened, his heart swelling with something deeper than desire. What began as awe had become love, not born from enchantment, but from the courage to share each other's burdens. For the first time, he no longer felt divided. He was no longer a poor fisherman chained by fate, nor a pawn of divine power. He was both, man and myth, bound to land and sea, yet free.
Years passed, and stories spread far beyond the village. Travelers came to the shore to hear of the fisherman who loved the queen of the southern sea, of the storm he defied, of the peace he forged. Some believed, some scoffed, but all carried the tale with them, until Arga's name was whispered in markets, sung by wandering bards, and carved into memory like the tide upon the sand. In the end, the lesson of his life was not about wealth or power, but about courage. The courage to choose not one path, but to make a new one when the world insists it cannot exist. And those who heard his story learned that sometimes love is not about surrender, but about standing firm when the storm demands you break. And so on nights when the moon is bright and the sea is calm, the villagers say they still see them, Arga and the queen, walking side by side where the waves kiss the shore, their laughter carried by the wind, a reminder that even the impossible can be bound together by love.